So, we're talking about ds106 things with Jim Groom.
Very good. It's 80s, and I like it a lot.
What do the 80s mean to today? And what do they mean to people today? A lot of the way things are was like spawned in the 1980s.
Well, it's funny because we did a revival of the 80s at UMW in 2015, where we recreated a living room from the 80s. And the idea, what I thought was really interesting, and Zach Whalen, a professor at Mary Washington, really kind of focused in on this, which I really loved, is the 80s represent for media, which a lot of what DS106 is interested, it suggested a convergence at the point of the living room where things that you used to have to go out of the house to do, like watch movies, like play video games. So it was this whole kind of explosion of the idea of the living room as a convergence of new media. You know, there's always touch points for any decade to think about media, right? But I like the idea of the 80s only because it's still so analog in its disruption. But the other point for me that's really interesting is the 80s were the home of the emergence of these VHS stores, right? Like these real B movies that introduced a whole subculture that, you know, kids in the suburbs like me couldn't get access to. You now had access to that based on your mom and pop video store. And that for me was a real kind of almost like an alternative means of education when you talk about like having a store that you can now go to almost like a library, idiosyncratic, so much unlike Netflix, right? And I think that for me was the difference between Netflix maybe and the VHS store or even local TV stations is you felt the idiosyncratic nature.
How like the Walkman changes music from being a communal listening experience to a private one.
Yeah, and the personal media. I mean, also like personal videos. A lot of that personalized, what we think of now as mobile, like small, like those nano video games that were introduced in the 80s were crazy. Another thing with the 80s too, you had the kind of cyberpunk, because that was a big emergence, like when we talk about the internet, right? Like the internet was around, like 30 people used it, but it was around. A lot of what we're still dealing with and struggling with on the internet was forged in the 80s around questions of like cyberpunk, novels like not only Neuromancer, but like Islands in the Net by Bruce Sterling, that really like crystallize some of the struggles we would have around a completely distributed network and what that could mean for the future. And so like the people in the 80s were trying to imagine our reality now. Think about HBO right now. And what are they showing? I mean, they're dealing with Chernobyl. And like what is one of the most memorable events of the 80s? We were still the generation that was being told that, you know, at any moment, you know, the Russians could nuke us. And that's shown in so many of the movies. Like for me, the 80s culture is all about television and movies. Emergence of hip hop, right? Like that's
Yeah.
is an 80s in some ways. I mean, the 70s is when it was really like being formed in the Bronx, but the 80s is when it freaking blew up.
Yeah, when you bring up hip hop, that's something that also goes into like art and design was the explosion of graffiti, street art, became mainstream. And
I think for me, another thing about the 80s that I'm really deeply interested in, New York City in the 80s was arguably at its worst. Like really, it was a place you feared deeply. And so the 80s, when you look at it in the films and in the music and in the culture of that moment, the media of that moment, like it really is framed as a war zone. But it's also framed as this place that's like the last frontier that can be kind of recolonized.
Wall Street, for example, is sort of the shift as where it's being recolonized, I would say.
Well, that movie, The Big Short, where they talk about the revolution that happened in Wall Street, which is kind of a dark revolution in that, you know, basically we had to bail out from the fraud of Wall Street in 2008, and that's still going on. But that all was reimagined, that whole new way of thinking about derivatives and thinking about, you know, bundling mortgages and then selling them to pension funds was an 80s creation. The Wall Street of the 80s is what gave way to our economic moment.
There are a lot of like cultural themes that go through media in the 80s that I did that existential dread, nuclear war, and it's mirrored sort of today in the coming environmental catastrophe.
Right on the cusp of the 80s, 90s was your first Earth Day. And you had your real first sense of like, I think you also had Exxon Valdez in the late 80s.
You had Chernobyl, you had Bhopal, the Union Carbide disaster.
The late 80s, too, for me. Then you had a director like Spike Lee who came on the scene. And I remember seeing Do the Right Thing in the theaters and was like, what was that? This stuff is real. Like we're gonna actually start like laying it down and calling people out. And like it ends, the film ends in a kind of basically a riot. That's pretty not only like on for Spike Lee and his way of understanding that where race relations got it, but then you think about what happened in the 90s.
Teen movies were the big thing then.
John Hughes.
Slasher films. The action hero is birthed in the 80s.
One of the things in the 80s I think we still had a serious hangover from was Vietnam. And like movies like Rambo are like dream visions of us going back and winning it. And the action hero, John Rambo, who in the first Rambo, First Blood, is like a pathetic returned veteran who gets no love and just goes ballistic. But he somehow transmogrifies into this U.S. savior figure who's going to win the war that we lost. Did we lose the war? Right? Like I think that was still a struggle for the nation to admit. And the media deals with the Vietnam War all the time. 80s TV, the soap opera. Monday Night Football, I don't think it started in the 80s. There's a Black Flag song that basically goes through all the 80s shows and talks about why they can't live without their TV.
Yeah, TV party. Yeah. Yeah, MTV is another thing, right? Because that shifts music from audio to a visual medium and really changes what it takes to be a performing musician. It's not enough to have that talent and musical ability. You have to have the look, too.
Because the 80s are also remembered for, like you said, Wall Street, greed, cocaine, right? And also a certain amount of, like, vanity. Like a certain amount of like, Americans almost going European with their sense of style and clothing and haircuts, the hair bands. But I've been interested how much of some of the popular bands now, like Churches, they go back to like synth music. But I think when you grew up in the 80s, like there's a general kind of actually active dislike of Reagan. The Reagan thing was interesting to me because the kind of reworking of Reagan's image now as a president of this, like, everyone feared him as Bonzo, right? Like he was this kind of our beginning of the movie star as,
right.
and the death knell of anything that's serious politics.
So it's going to be really interesting to me to see how students react to this, what they would decide to make out of it. Maybe we should talk a bit about what students do in this class. We're going to be playing with various kinds of media and making of it what we want. And there's a whole treasure trove of stuff from the 80s that we can do that with and bring it into a present context or not. We're going to be building various media projects, making our own narratives out of whatever we find. And hopefully, as a class, it coalesces into some kind of a story.
Stranger things have happened. But more than anything, it was the TV, the way in which news worked, the way in which commercials worked. And I wonder if there would be a way to think through how a group of students could, watch. Like, could we program a day of TV from the 80s on a particular channel? I have it. So could we do that as a way to kind of have them imbibe TV of the 80s? Like, we spent a lot of time in video not really thinking about that, but what would it mean like to look at particular kinds of video, like the way in which commercials work, the way in which these TV sitcoms work, the way in which, news in the 80s worked, the effects they used, but also like the topics they talked about as a way to kind of dig into the 80s and have them make something of that. Part of digging in the 80s and part of what we have with the internet is also like a time machine to kind of revisit some of that stuff and assess for themselves and make the connections for themselves between what we see in these resources that are now online and how we understand them today. And so I really think that understanding that and encouraging that might be a really interesting way to give the media creation that they're doing some sort of direction and objective. Is it kind of like an interrogation of not only the media online and how we get it, how we build it, but the way in which the decade of the 80s understood and presented itself. And it's not one thing, it's a series of things that give us an impression of the 80s. And they're always generic, right? The 80s were gaudy, the 80s were greedy. But where does that come from? What in the media crystallizes those kind of broad generalizations? So I would really like to see the media creation maybe dig into that and show like Stranger Things are interesting because they are doing that. They're actually looking at the 80s not as a generalization, but through its details. And that's where they're coming up with a kind of a sensibility that, again, is as much 2017, 18, 19 as it is 1984. How were they reporting Chernobyl? How were they reporting Valdez? How were they reporting gentrification? How they were reporting violence in New York City? Like just as one topic to find your way in of many, because you got to think the students here all have interests. Some of them may be interested in architecture, or some of them might be art, some of them might be sport. Like all of that, there's an in the 80s. And the great thing about ds106 is we don't tell you what to do. We don't tell you what to be interested in. The job, I think, for the student would be to find the corollary of their interest in the 80s and understand some of those distinctions and start using media and art and creation to draw that out and demonstrate that for their viewer, for their reader, for their listener, whatever it would be. Right? Because I think one of the nice things about doing a decade is that a lot of what we have now existed then. You're into video games? Well, there's a lot to do. If you're into movies, there's a lot to do. If you're into music, there's a lot to do. For me, I'm probably going to go through this class looking at 80s video games because of an interest I have right now. And that's where I'm going to spend my time looking at the aesthetic, looking at how they advertise them. Like, I'm into that stuff. But I hope the students also find the thing that they want to focus on and investigate and then make art around, because that would make the class fun.
Yeah, we all have that option to make the class what we want it to be, to make it fun for ourselves, make it something that we're making together. It'll be interesting to see what we come up with.
One of the things that really takes hold in the 80s was the class-based, and it's white suburban class-based struggle.
I think we covered a lot of different ideas here. Hopefully it gives people ideas of what they can latch onto and what they can make out of this. And if people have ideas that don't fit in with anything that we talked about, that's okay too, because that becomes something we didn't even think of.
Yeah, and we're going to come with our own assumptions and biases about what we find interesting. But ds106, that's the point. What you find interesting is what you should cultivate.
All right, so that's ds106.
For life.